Alfred Russel Wallace was actually one of the most famous of all Victorian scientists. In fact, it's probably correct to say that he's one of the most famous scientists of all time, because he, together with Charles Darwin, were the first proposers of the great theory of evolution by natural selection, which someone has described as possibly the greatest idea to ever occur to a human mind. When Wallace was 5 years old, he and his family moved to the town of Hertford, just north of London. It was there that he received his only formal education at Hales Grammar School. The family finances got worse and worse until finally they couldn't afford the small amount of money that Wallace's school fees cost, so they were forced to withdraw Wallace from school, aged only 14. Became an apprentice to his older brother William, who was a land surveyor. William's work involved travelling around Britain and doing surveys for new railway lines, etc., which were going in at the time. In the early 1840s, the brothers were based at the town of Neath in Wales, and it was there that Wallace first developed his interest in natural history. Then in 1843, surveying work became scarce, and William was forced to let his brother go and find another job. Wallace eventually found work in Leicester. Leicester was actually a real key part of his life story, because it was there that he met amateur naturalist Henry Walter Bates, who he struck up a friendship with. He moved back to Wales, still corresponding with Bates. And it was whilst he was in Neath in Wales that he came upon a book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. Wallace was fascinated by this idea of evolution and became an early convert. And a few years later, he suggested to Henry Walter Bates, who he was still friends with, that they go off on a collecting expedition. Bates thought this was a brilliant idea. In 1848, they set off for the Amazon, paid for a passage on a ship over to Brazil, and went off. Early on in the trip they collected together, but then apparently they quarrelled and split up. Wallace was to go up the mighty Rio Negro, which, although it looks like a small tributary of the Amazon, it's actually a huge river, one of the world's biggest in its own right. And Wallace was the first person to go up the Rio Negro, and using his skills in mapping that he had developed while he was a surveyor, he was the first person to actually draw an accurate map of the river. He also got into areas where nobody had ever collected plants and animals before. In the first 2 years of his trip, he managed to post specimens back to England, but his most interesting specimens from the Rio Negro, etc., he was forced to take on board with him when he went back to Britain after 4 years in Amazonia. Unfortunately, 26 days into the voyage, when they were literally in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the ship caught fire and they were forced to abandon to the lifeboats, and all of Wallace's collections of amazing specimens that from the upper reaches of the Rio Negro, etc., were totally destroyed. Anyway, they floated around on lifeboats for 10 days. Wallace was in a terrible state, blistered from the sun, dehydrated, etc., and they were picked up by an old leaky vessel, and they actually ran out of food and water part way back to Britain, because basically they didn't have enough food on board for the extra people. Wallace was actually very lucky, because his agent Samuel Stevens, who had been selling his natural history specimens for him, had actually insured Wallace's collections, and that enabled him to live fairly comfortably in London. Because he wanted to continue his studies about evolution, etc., and also he needed to make a living, he decided to go off to what he called the Malay Archipelago, what is now Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia and East Timor. It was in the Malay Archipelago that Wallace made probably his two greatest discoveries. The first was what is now called the Wallace Line, an imaginary line dividing the faunas of the Oriental region, as it's called, to the west, and the Australasian region to the east. And Wallace was amazed when he crossed over from Bali to Lombok and suddenly realized that Lombok had a completely different bird fauna to Bali. You wouldn't expect it, that two adjacent islands would have totally different types of birds. And he realized that this was a very significant observation. And this imaginary line was named Wallace's line some years afterwards by Thomas Henry Huxley. Wallace continued to think about evolution and tried to get evidence and try an insight into how evolution actually worked. And he made his first breakthrough in 1855 when he was on the island of Borneo. In Wallace's Sarawak law paper, he proposed what he called a law that every species has come into existence coincident in space and time with the closely allied species. This suggested that evolution must have occurred. He sent off this paper hoping that people in Britain would be convinced that evolution was actually, a fact, and that Wallace's argument showed that, it should be taken seriously. Charles Lyell, who was one of the most famous scientists in Britain, had thought that his paper was very interesting indeed and had actually mentioned it to Charles Darwin. He ended up going further and further east in the Malay archipelago and used the small spice island of Ternate in Indonesia as his base. There's a big neighbouring island called Halmahera, and it was there in 1858, in February. Wallace was suffering probably from malaria and was lying in a small native hut in a village. And suddenly the idea of survival of the fittest occurred to him. He remembered reading years and years ago in Leicester an influential book by Malthus called Principles of Population. And Malthus said that the human population tends to grow exponentially over time, whereas the food supply grows much more slowly, and at some point where the two lines of the graph intersect, population growth will outstrip food production, and then there'll be a struggle for existence, and only the fittest basically would survive. So he came up with this idea applied to humans, and Wallace, while he was suffering in his malarial fit, suddenly realized that almost certainly the same thing had to happen with plants and animals and living things, and that populations tend to increase, food runs out, there'll be some individuals in the population that are fitter, bigger, stronger, whatever, and they'll be the ones who tend to survive and pass on their favourable characteristics to their offspring. And that's how evolution works. And this was, an amazing idea. He had been thinking about it for 10 years. Finally, he had the answer. When he got back to Ternate, he wrote a letter and an essay explaining his idea, and put it in the post on the next mail ship to none other than Charles Darwin. In fact, Darwin had been thinking about it for 20 or more years and had come up with the idea of natural selection, about 20 years ago, but hadn't published anything. And what happened next was that Charles Lyell and another of Darwin's friends called Hooker, who was a botanist, decided to present Darwin's ideas, unpublished ideas, which they knew about, on evolution by natural selection, together with Wallace's essay, to a meeting of the Linnean Society of London, all within about 14 days of Wallace's essay arriving in Britain. However, that was the first public announcement of evolution by natural selection, and a month later it was actually published in print by the Society. And what it did was send Darwin into basically a frenzy of trying to put together a book on the subject, and it was basically the famous book On the Origin of Species. And when he got back to Britain, he was quite a celebrity, especially as he was now associated with Darwin. And he spent the rest of his long life, he lived till 90 years old, promoting the idea of natural selection and working on a very wide range of other subjects. And he's also recognized as being the founder of the entire subject of evolutionary biogeography, and wrote two very important books on that subject: The Geographical Distribution of Animals and a book called Island Life. And it was basically the foundation of the study of how plants and animals are distributed around the earth and why they are found in certain areas and not in others, etc. He was buried in Broadstone, Dorset,